And now, it's time for another Dice Tower review with Ryan Metzler.
Hey everyone, Ryan Metzler here again, and today we're going to be taking a look at an older game that falls just slightly out of the top 100 games. We're going to be taking a look at Antiquity by Splotter, which is a game for 2 to 4 people, which kind of employs area control and resource management, along with a little bit of a worker placement type of mechanic. The game has both a easier variant and then a much more punishing variant which you can play, depending on your ability of skill, and is really just kind of a very good game, which will probably be much higher into the ranking of games once it sees its reprint coming around this Essen season. So with that said, let's take a look at what comes inside of the game and how it plays, and then I'll give you what my thoughts are on it. In Antiquity, each player will be playing on 2 different boards. The first is the board that you can see here, which is a player's individual board, which will show several different things. The first thing you can see is that there's a map of a city on the board, represented by a square made up of smaller squares, in which you'll be building buildings, which will be small pieces of cardboard that look like this, that will have different functions within your own personal city. Additionally, over here on the right-hand side, you will see several different pieces of cardboard, and on top of those pieces of cardboard, wooden cubes, which are going to represent workers and their homes. At the beginning of the game, you start with no workers, but you may build up to 4 of these homes for free, which will come with 1 worker apiece. And they'll be built over here on your city, taking up one of these small squares and giving you that worker to use for future actions. Future workers and buildings will cost different resources, and as you go further down this stack of buildings here, it'll cost you more. For example, the first one that costs anything costs 1 food, but other ones will cost either food and luxuries, different combinations of goods that you'll acquire throughout the game. Buildings that are built over here will provide you with benefits, and you'll be using resources that you acquire on a different board in order to build these buildings. Here you can see all of the different buildings that may be built on a player's board throughout the game. And you can see there's quite a few of them, varying in different sizes, different shapes, and you'll be kind of Tetrising these into your original city in order to try and get them to fit and get the most buildings in there possible. Each of these buildings has a different function, and those functions are going to be laid out on the sheet that I showed you previously. But for building these, you'll get some either type of action or some type of benefit on either your board or the player board throughout the game. For example, storage buildings, which are these little buildings here, will allow you to keep different goods from turn to turn, while the Explorer will allow you to explore new areas and expand your general empire, finding new things on the board. Carts are going to be required for taking actions onto the main board, building buildings not on your board, but out on the main world board where both players have access. So you'll be using your workers to place onto these carts, and then using these carts in order to build things out onto the main board. The harbor will give you control over water regions, and then these 5 buildings in the center here actually have special uses. These 5 buildings in the center do something a little bit different. Each one of them has their own ability except for the university. Theology allows you to change your cathedral, which is going to be this building over here, destroying it and building a new one later on if you like, changing what your victory conditions will be, and I'll go over that in a moment. Biology will allow you to plant goods without actually having any goods, starting a farm. Alchemy will let you clear up pollution, which is going to be a problem for areas that you've planted, and in the more advanced game going to be a problem for just general gameplay. Each turn you'll get more pollution, which is a problem. And philosophy allows you to ignore things that require different resources. For example, something might require you to use 2 different luxury resources. With philosophy, you could use 2 of the same. The university, when next to these buildings, if you place one of your workers onto the university, it will activate any of these buildings that it's touching. Otherwise, you have to activate each of the individual buildings in order to get their effects. So by having the university next to all 4 of these buildings, you could activate all 4 of them with 1 worker. The brewery is going to allow you to place inns onto the board, and inns are going to expand your zone of influence, allowing you to build in more areas. The hospital is going to let you prevent or get rid of graves from your board. You know, prevent, but you'll get rid of graves from your board. And graves are something only in the advanced game that happen when either you have too much pollution or you have famine that's going to kill things, kill guys in your area, and you're not going to be able to place them. So you'll place graves onto your board. And graves have no function. This is onto your little player board. Graves have no function except for that they take up space, and if you fill up all of the empty space, they start going into your other buildings, preventing them from being used. The forced labor camp will allow you to harvest goods faster, but you'll lose the first good. The cathedral is going to determine your victory condition. Depending on which of the victory conditions you choose when you build your cathedral, you'll have different endgame conditions. The dump is going to allow you to prevent pollution, the granary will allow you to ignore famine, and the stables are going to increase your zone of influence by 1 when you have it occupied. Finally, you may build fountains, which are small little square buildings, which are going to allow you to reduce your famine by 1, so you have to have less food at the end of each turn, and to prevent 1 pollution. The rest of Antiquity is played out on a general board where you'll have cities for players, which represent their cities that they already have that you saw on their own individual player mats, and then all different types of terrain and some different counters. So here you can see the setup for 2 players. 1 player over here on this tile and 1 player over here on this tile, with their main cities indicated by these gigantic pieces here. After players have taken their turns in their city by placing their workers onto any buildings they have, building any buildings they'd like to build, they're going to then move out onto this board and perform several different steps. The first step is that they're going to go and they'll be able to build any buildings on the board that they've decided to build using carts on their city boards. And so there are a couple different types of buildings they can build out here. One is a fishery. You have to build within an area of control from your city, which is going to be 2 hexagons from your city to start the game, and this can be changed by the stables or by building inns out on the board. But one building, the fishery, which would require some goods to build, you can place out and you would put it next to water, and it's going to put fish out onto any of the water that you have. Now, I'm not going to show you how to put out fish, but just know that putting a fishery out would put fish out onto the water. You could also build inns if you had built a brewery, and breweries it would go out, 2 spaces from your city and expand your area of influence 2 spaces from there. So now, instead of being stopped here for influence, I would move out 2 further and my influence would go to here. Instead of building buildings, you could put farms out, and farms are going to be how you gather resources. When you build a farm, you choose an area within that 2 influence region of your city, and you pick that spot and you're going to put out a farm for a type of resource matching that spot on all of the hexagons around it that match. So for example, if I were to choose this wood spot, I would start building a wood farm on this spot. And what I would do, and this is where the game gets a little fiddly, is that I would put out these field hexagons on all of the adjacent wood spots, which would be these 5 spots here. On top of that, I would put tree counters, which are going to represent the wood. And these would be the goods that I'm going to harvest each turn from my farm. So, once I've got that all set up, I put a worker out, the worker that I used to build the farm, on top of the center hexagon. Each round during the harvest step, I'm going to take one of these goods and I'm going to add it to my player board, giving me resources to use throughout the game. Wood is the most important resource. However, it's the only resource that doesn't result in what is called pollution, which is going to be a counter that's going to prevent land from being used again until cleaned up. So let's look at another good. Let's say, for example, I want to put out stone. And stone has to be harvested from mountain spaces, which are going to be these reddish areas around my city. Since these are within my area of influence, I can start a stone farm there. And what I would do is, instead of laying down those field spots like I did for the trees, I would first put down pollution markers, which look like this. They got a little skull on them. And let's say I chose this hexagon here. I would put a pollution marker in that space and every hex surrounding it that is of the same type. On top of that would go stone markers, which look like this. And I would put the stone markers on top of that. And so now you can see we're kind of stacking tiny little counters here. And then on top of that would go the cube which started the farm by building it out onto the board. Each turn I'll harvest one of these stone until the last turn when I harvest this final stone in the center spot, and then my worker will come back to my board. But you can see as I harvest the stone, the areas become polluted and now they're no longer available for use. After players have done all of their building out on the board by putting down farms or different buildings, they're going to go ahead and store any goods that they have left over in the turn, if they have any storage facilities, and then they will move on to harvesting, meaning that they're going to take those goods, one good from each area that they have, and add them to their player board. After harvesting, players are allowed to explore if they've built an explorer, and exploring would allow them to turn over one of these tokens if it's within their area of influence. These tokens show several different things, which will be a good that they get. For example, this one shows wheat, which is a food resource, but can also cause bad things to happen, such as increasing famine, which will be food that you have to have on hand at the end of the turn, or else you'll suffer a penalty. Now, there's one thing I failed to mention, is that there's a final type of building that you can put onto the board, and that's these cities, which will require bunches of different goods to place out. It's actually quite a large amount of goods, but it will vastly improve your ability to perform throughout the game by giving you new regions to build on. It's essentially going to give you a whole new city, which are represented by these little tiles here. You can see there's new cities, and each time you build one of these cities, you're going to get a new one of these. It has to be built within your area of influence, so, you know, if I eventually wanted to build out, I'd have to build out somewhere over here. They can't be built over water, but they can give you more space to build in. One of the very interesting things about Antiquity is the fact that there are variable player victory points, and basically, at the beginning of the game, you don't actually have a decided way to win the game. No player can technically win the game at the beginning because there are no victory conditions. But once you build your cathedral onto the board, which looks like a cross, you have to choose one of these 5 victory conditions. And really there's only 4, but the 5th one is somewhat unique. When you build this cathedral, you dedicate yourself to one of these 5 saints. And each one of them has a different victory condition and a different special ability. So essentially you're going to choose one of these, you're going to get the special ability, and you're going to dedicate yourself towards finishing their victory condition above all other aspects of the game. And that's Antiquity, so it's a relatively actually simple game. It doesn't look it when you look at it because there's a bazillion pieces. There's chits everywhere, there's different player boards, it's a little fiddly, okay, it's a lot fiddly, but it's really a great game. And the reason it's great is because, not of the fiddliness, but because of the depth that's involved with such a simplistic game. I mean, really all you do is you build on your board, then you build on the other board, and you try and avoid pollution and famine and complete your victory condition. It's not really hard once you get through the motions of one turn. You can pretty much just go through the turns over and over again until somebody wins. But the varying player victory conditions, the ability to plant different things, to expand your empire, to really not even show what you're trying to do for victory until near the end of the game, is just a very interesting design. Now, the game is not widely available. It's outside of the top 100 in terms of rating, probably because right now it costs about $300. But the game is being reprinted and is supposed to be out around this Essen season, so very soon here, and I expect to see a ratings bump due to that availability. So if you like worker placement or area control or resource management games, I suggest taking a very, very, very hard look at Antiquity, because it's the type of game that you could play over and over again and really never have the same experience twice. To try this game and over 800 others before you buy them, visit BoardGameExchange.com.
Thanks for joining us today. For more written, audio, and video reviews, as well as the #1 board game podcast, check out the website at www.thedicetower.com. Until then, this is Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower.